So welcome to today's Dharma Talk. And what I'd like to talk about today is, as I mentioned earlier, spiritual pleasure and the cultivation of joy, happiness, contentment, and peace or equanimity. And I've added to the title, regardless of what's happening in the world. And I'm not sure how much I'm going to be talking about that regardlessness. But anyway, what I'd like to talk about is that topic, that spiritual pleasure and cultivating joy, from two levels. One level is the way the Buddha talks about it in the suttas, and insofar as it being the level of highly refined, concentrated all the states of consciousness, otherwise known as jhanas, and in its relationship to ultimate awakening. And the other level is more like levels of concentration that are not at that deep jhana level, um, but are concentrated nonetheless. And also levels of awakening that are not necessarily at the ultimate level of realizing Nibbana, but at the level of realizing relative happiness, peace, joy, and freedom. So that's what I'll be talking about today. But also, um, I want to mention a little bit about the Buddha's awakening, and that's where we'll start. So, before Siddhartha Gautama was the Buddha, he was called the Bodhisattva because a Bodhisattva is someone on the way to becoming a Buddha. So that's how we name him. And the Bodhisattva was driven to seek awakening due to realizing the pervasiveness and ubiquity of dukkha. You remember what dukkha is, birth, aging, sickness, death, pain, grief, lamentation, and despair, getting what you don't want, not getting what you want, and being parted from that which is dear to you. And in fact, clinging to this very idea that there's a continual, lasting, autonomous self within changing experiences. So the Buddha, of course, was stimulated, I guess one way you could say it, or aroused to seek awakening because he had four visions. These visions were of a dead person, an ill person, and an aging person. And that was like symbolic of this pervasiveness and ubiquity of dukkha, unsatisfactoriness. And he also had a vision of a samana. Samana is someone who's seeking awakening. So he was inspired to leave home and go out and seek out awakening, seek out enlightenment. He was a seeker. And when he first set out on his quest, he found a teacher, he sought out a teacher called Alara Kalama. And he found this teacher who was said to be enlightened or awakened. And he listened to his teacher and he studied the teachings and knew them off by heart. But at this point in time, the Bodhisattva thought, surely there's some way of knowing these teachings, some way from experience. Surely there's some way of meditating to have this experience rather than just being intellectual, would be something that's within my being, within the being, like awakening within himself. So the Buddha asked Alara Kalama to teach him how to meditate, and Alara Kalama taught him how to attain what's called the seventh jhana, the seventh absorption, or it's this particular state of highly refined concentration, all the state of consciousness, is the feature of it is nothingness. No thingness. And I won't go into details explaining what that is, other than to say it's really, really refined and quite a state to reach at this level as well. So, but according to the Mahasaka Sutta, Mahasakata Sutta. In other words, the longer discourse with Sakata. I can't pronounce his name properly. Um, it occurred to the Bodhisattva that this teaching doesn't lead to disillusionment, dispassion, cessation, peace, insight, awakening, and extinguishment. It only leads to as far as rebirth in the dimension of nothingness. Nothingness is sometimes considered like a realm, and Buddha was seeking out full awakening, and the way he sought out full awakening was to short circuit this tendency of being born, aging, dying, being reborn, aging, dying, which is um, which is being caught up in these cycles of suffering. I mean, he could see that as in terms of lifetimes, but also in terms of moment to moment life. Like there's moments arising and passing, and it's like we're being reborn each moment. Like we're going through these moments of dying and being reborn every moment. And the Buddha saw that reaching this particular level, it's called attainment, was pretty amazing, but it didn't actually extinguish this tendency of being caught up in samsara. He wanted to be free from samsara. So he sought out another teacher called Udaka, son of Rama. And again, he memorized the teachings. He knew them off by heart. And also, he learnt the meditations in relationship to this. And he attained the eighth jhana. The eighth jhana, which the features of the eighth jhana are described as neither perception nor non-perception. And I won't go into great explanations about that right now because um, I kind of I know it intellectually. I can't say that I know it experientially, but uh, but I know it intellectually, and it's quite a profound state of consciousness. But again, um, the Buddha the Buddha realized that this wasn't the enlightenment. In fact, when he went to see Alara Kalama, he was so Alara Kalama realized that this guy's really, really got it. And he said, look, why don't you join me as a teacher? Why don't you join me and we can teach together the path to this realization? And the Buddha said, no, thank you very much. He declined the offer. With Udaka, son of Rama, he taught the Bodhisattva to a place where he was quite, to this attainment where he was quite realized. And rather than just offering him a partnership in the teaching, he said, why don't you become the teacher? He was a well-known teacher at the time. Why don't you become the teacher? You're much more enlightened than I am. But the Buddha declined again because he saw that it wasn't going to reach. It wasn't helping him exit from the wheel of samsara, like the cycles of samsara. So what the Buddha did then, and this is, you probably well know this story by now, he he went on a he went on a journey. He went and practiced in the forest, and he practiced all the practices that could relate to self-mortification and reducing any sense of sensual pleasure, stopping sensual pleasure all the time, completely. So, I mean, he did all sorts of extreme practices like holding his breath in lots of different ways. And after a while, he realized that all that holding his breath did was give him terrible headaches. And, and then he stopped eating food, but he thought amongst himself, he thought within himself, oh, maybe I can just stop eating food. And these angels or the devas that were around him saying, well, if you stopped eating food, we would inject um, angelic food into your system somehow. We'd keep you sustained. So the Buddha thought, oh, well, I'll eat minimal food. I'll just eat a grain of rice or, whatever it was. So there's this description after him doing this for a while that he's so skinny that if he touched his back, he would be touching his belly. Like he was so thin and he'd fall over. He wouldn't be able to sit. And he was so emaciated that he almost died. And at that point in time, he said, "Oh, this isn't working. All this is doing is giving me headaches and making me sick." And uh, he said some people would see him and they'd say, "He's a black person," because he was so grubby. And other people would say, "No, he's not a black person. Just very dirty," or something like that. And he said he would rub his skin and his hair would fall out. He was so denourished. So he thought, this isn't a way. This isn't working. All it's doing is making me sick, giving me headaches. It's not. There's no benefit in this self-mortification. And then he had a memory. He recollected a time when he was in his father's fields and he was under the shade of, I'm not sure some people say it was a rose apple tree and some people say it was a black plum tree. Either way, he was under the shade of a cool tree. He was under the cool shade of a tree, and he had, as it goes, it says something like this. How does it go? Then he recalled a time when he was sitting in the cool shade of a plum tree, a black plum tree, black plum or a rose apple tree, while his father was off working and quite secluded from sensual pleasures and unskillful behaviors. The Buddha was secluded from sensual pleasures, like he wasn't surrounded by all sorts of sensory pleasures. He was just sitting in the cool shade of a tree, and he wasn't engaging in any unskillful, unwholesome behaviors. And what happened is he spontaneously entered into the first absorption, which is called a jhana. It's another way of describing a jhana, which had rapture and bliss born of seclusion and concentration. What this means is that the first jhana is a highly refined state of concentration, or a state of consciousness that its features are of piety or joy. Joy, and sometimes it's described as rapture. And it's a it's it comes about from secluding oneself from the hindrances. Like it's not you don't not cutting off the hindrances at this point. The hindrances of obsessive sensual desire, um, obsessive sensual desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness and agitation, and paralyzing doubt. They only get cut off with full awakening. But he was secluded. He could put them aside to the extent where his mind could become gathered and focused onto one thing, and arising from that concentration, this experience of piti came about. So he could see it arises from that sense of being secluded or distant from these unwholesome qualities, and also his memory, his concentration. And it occurred to him, and I'm just going to quote. I'm speaking from the sutta called, and I'll try to pronounce the name again, the longer discourse of Sakkaka. Sakkaka. And this is a translation by Bhikkhu Sujato. So he says to himself, why am I afraid of this type of pleasure? It has nothing to do with the sensory world pleasures and unwholesome qualities. He realized that he was afraid of spiritual pleasure. And I'll explain spiritual pleasure in a little while. But basically, he's saying, why am I afraid of this pleasure? It's not the same sort of pleasure that we get from hedonic sensual pleasures. Or it's not what happens with unwholesome qualities. These are wholesome qualities. And as the story goes, the Bodhisattva then built up his strength, and free from the philosophical teachings of Alala Kalama and Udaka Sanarama, when they taught their teachings, it was, or it was, not only did they teach the meditation eventually, but they taught this kind of philosophical understanding of things. And in this case, the Buddha was free from all that. He was free from all that conceptualization. and he entered the first four jhanas. And I'll explain, well, the first four jhanas are, the first jhana is, it is related to having this experience of joy, piti. The second jhana, its feature is happiness. It's a bit more refined than joy. The third jhana, and these are material jhanas, material in that they're of the body, or they're you can sort of feel them. The jhanas that he attained in with those two teachers were called immaterial jhanas. They were all of the mind. So these material jhanas, we can experience them in our body, and they are very highly concentrated states. And what he did was he went to the fourth jhana. It's called the fourth material jhana. And in, in in this way, his mind was purified, bright, flawless, rid of corruptions, pliable, steady, workable, and imperturbable. I'm just quoting the words that are written in the sutta. And what that means is that his mind was fit for purpose. He had created a concentrated mind, so much so that he could see clearly into phenomena and see it the way it was. Um, and according to the longer discourse of Sakaka, he had a full recollection of past lives, if there is such a thing as past lives. Anyway, he says that in the sutras, it says he had a full recollection of past lives. The knowledge of the passing away and rebirth of beings according to their karma. In other words, we are what we have done. We get reborn depending on the conditions that come before. There's this death rebirth process is about causes and conditions. Like we have experiences and we grasp after the experiences and we become something, and then we live that something through, and then we become something else. We die and get rebirth. So what he was seeing here was that beings were arising and passing away, like they're having passing away and rebirth, dependent upon their karmic accumulations. In other words, depending upon what actions they do, they would have those. They have the result of those actions. And the other big realization he had was the knowledge and the destruction of the mental distortions. I gave a talk on the mental distortions in June. It's the mental. Sometimes they're called defilements. They're also called kilesa in Pali. Mental distortions are what keeps us bound in cycles of suffering. And when we can see through the mental distortions, they're driven by the way, they're driven by greed, ignorance, and hatred. When we can see through that, we wake up, basically. So he had this knowledge and of the destruction of these mental distortions, and this led to liberation. In other words, the Bodhisattva woke up and he became the Buddha. A Buddha means an awakened one. That's literally the translation of it. So, in the first discourse he gave, which was to the five ascetics, and it's called Setting in Motion the Wheel of Dhamma, the Buddha spoke of the middle way as avoiding two extremes: sensual indulgence, which he described as low, vulgar, worldly, ignoble, and unprofitable, and self-mortification, which was described as painful, ignoble, and unprofitable. So, in other words, he's talking about these two pathways that beings go through. Like we go down these pathways of beating ourselves up, which is useless and unprofitable, unbeneficial for anybody, or sensual indulgence, which is kind of low and vulgar in the long run, and unbeneficial in the long run. So in avoiding these two extremes, the middle way, which is described as sometimes the middle way is called the Eightfold Path. Uh, the middle way gives vision, gives knowledge, and leads to calm, insight, to enlightenment, to Nibbana or Nirvana. So, the middle way, is often called the Noble Eightfold Path. It's called, and as you know, and you've heard me repeat this many times, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. This practice of ethics in order to have a composed mind, uh, a level of composure that you're able to develop your mind. Then we develop our mind with meditation, which is right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And then with that meditation, it gives rise to wisdom. And wisdom is often described in the Eightfold Path. The wisdom component is this right view and right intention. So the Buddha then taught the way of freedom for 45 years. And we need insight to wake up. We need this realization of the way things actually are to wake up. And when we wake up, we see the way things actually are. We see it with insight. And essentially, as I mentioned in the introduction to today, in the orientation and basic instructions, there were three kind of pathways taught. The pathway of serenity first, then insight only, and insight and serenity co-joined. So I also mentioned this morning that the distinctions between serenity and insight only really came about 9 centuries after the Buddha's time in India, with the editing of this massive text called the Visuddhimagga, or the Path of Purification, which became a kind of a gold standard text for the way of understanding meditation, and also kind of gave guidelines to teachers and practitioners on how to practice and how to teach. So the serenity first, then insight refers to how we can strengthen our concentration, then use the power of that concentration or the power of that samadhi to look into the way things are. And you probably can remember my analogy of the pond, the pond analogy, where, there's a muddy pond and we lose our precious jewels, and we can't see our precious jewels, so we wait for the sediment to settle, and we protect the pond from getting more muddy. We protect it from kids jumping in and splashing around, and uh, we protect it from all the mud being stirred up. And we wait and we let the mud settle, and we can see clearly into the bottom of the pond. And so we have a better vision. But of course, when we see clearly in the bottom of the pond, we see, all the terrible things we might have done in our lives, or, hindrances, or all the things that are kind of getting in the road of our practice. But we're able to remove them. We're able to remove them from the pond. And then we still can't see our precious jewels that we may have lost in the pond, but we then inquire under the rocks and look around, and eventually we find our precious jewels. So the precious jewels are related to our wisdom and insight. The sediment settling is like a serenity meditation, where all our minds become really clear. And the protection of the pond is like our ethics. So when our lives are not getting stirred up by unskillful behavior or unskillful things that we're doing, actions and speech um, and and so on. And basically, that process of letting the mud settle, is like clearing our mind with serenity. And then we use the clarity of serenity to investigate, and the inquiry under the rocks is like mindfulness and inquiry. It's like the aspects of insight meditation, where we find our wisdom, we regain our wisdom. So serenity first, then insight is one pathway. That's the pathway the Buddha took, and he developed this very powerful mind with concentrated states. Then he looked into phenomena and he woke up. Insight only is like the practice of the four establishments of mindfulness, uh, mindfulness of body, feelings, mind, and phenomena. And it doesn't include this um, conscious direction of creating a really concentrated mind. And it works on this uh, momentary consciousness, a momentary concentration. We still have concentration, but it's a momentary concentration. It's not a sustained concentration on any one thing. So that's the insight only path. And serenity and insight co-joined refers to, as I mentioned this morning, how serenity and insight are kind of simultaneously cultivated in a way where one will spend some time concentrating the mind and then some other time looking into phenomenon and then coming back and going backwards and forwards between this inquiry and insight and absorptions. So when I went to Thailand, you know, nearly 50 years ago now, nearly about 48 years ago, um, I um, I went to the forest monasteries, and the instructions were simply calm and still your mind, and then inquire. Basically, that was it. So it's just kind of going backwards and forwards between serenity and insight, and that that's a really valid path to waking up. So so what are the differences between the pleasure experienced under the rose apple tree with the Buddha and hedonic sensual pleasures? Well, the Buddha, in another sutta, in a sutta called the Satipatthana Sutta, which is a sutta on the four establishments of mindfulness, in regards to feelings or these hedonic qualities of the hedonic tones of experience as pleasure, as pleasant, unpleasant, or neither. What the Buddha explained is that there's ways of categorizing these feelings, and that is as pleasant, unpleasant, or neither, and also as worldly or unworldly. So, what does this mean? Well, worldly means that our experience, our pleasure or displeasure, or neither pleasure or displeasure, is kind of the world. It keeps us bound to samsara, it keeps us bound to going around in circles of suffering, actually. And an example of a worldly pleasure would be the pleasure and joy the pleasure we get from the taste of chocolate. That's my example here that I talked about. And I talked about this the other night when was it the other night? I did talk about this I did do this talk at the Kuan Yin Center a couple of weeks ago. But I talked about the taste of chocolate as being a worldly pleasure. And an unworldly pleasure, or let's call it a spiritual feeling, unworldly or spiritual feelings relates to the feelings that arise in the context of the Eightfold Path, in the context of moving along that pathway, either at noble levels or in ennobling levels, even to the extent where we may not experience awakening, but we're on that path. We're doing wholesome actions. And I would say something like the pleasant feelings of mindfulness of the impermanence of the taste of chocolate, that pleasant feeling based on the mindfulness or the awareness of the impermanent qualities of the taste of chocolate could be called spiritual pleasure. And unpleasant spiritual feelings could be related to something called samvega. Samvega is a Pali term. Samvega is the shock and dismay and spiritual urgency to reach liberation. It's when we see dukkha, when we see the depths of dukkha, and we're really, really motivated to practice to short circuit our cycling in this wheel of suffering. We're really motivated. That realization of that is unpleasant, but it's motivating us to be on the path. It's a kind of unworldly, it's a spiritual, unpleasant feeling, if that makes sense. So, of course, the Buddha expounded to be cautious of worldly pleasures. Be cautious of having too much chocolate, having too much sex, blah, 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 blah. Cautious of worldly pleasures because they often, well, most often, they lead to attachments or clinging and grasping. Often they lead to craving. And this craving, clinging, grasping keeps us bound to this cycle of suffering. He said, however, as I mentioned earlier, not to be afraid of spiritual pleasure because spiritual pleasure can lead to sublime states of mind and deeply concentrated altered states of consciousness called jhanas. And they they give us eventually they give us the power and clarity for insight and awakening. So there is a saying in the sutras, and it goes something like this. Well, this is how it's how I can quote it. Concentration has a proximal cause, happiness. Happiness has a proximal cause, tranquility. Tranquility has a proximal cause, rapture. Rapture has a proximal cause, gladness. So what I'm saying here is that gladness can lead to rapture or joy or piety in Pali. Gladness can lead to joy. Joy can lead to tranquility. Tranquility can lead to happiness. Remember, happiness is this, it's called sukha in Pali. It's this hmm, light-hearted well-being. It's a kind of a heartfelt in my view. And happiness can lead to concentration. So that's what it's saying. So what is gladness? What's this gladness? In Pali, it's called pamoja. Um, and in my view, gladness is a form of spiritual pleasure. And we can find spiritual pleasure in many things. Uh, we can find spiritual pleasure in being kind, in being generous, uh, to studying Dhamma, to reading something that's really interesting and wholesome, to with performing virtuous deeds, persisting at a task and succeeding, and overcoming the hindrances. And if you can remember, the last talk I talked about the mental distortions, and I highlighted the hindrances. That there's particular joys in overcoming each and every one of the hindrances, and the Buddha's made analogies for these joys, uh, like for example, the joy of overcoming sensual desire is like the joy of being debt free. And the joy of overcoming ill will, like rising above ill will as a hindrance, is like the joy of overcoming a horrible affliction. And the joy of finding some, well, finding some energy and a way out of being stuck in sloth and torpor is like the joy of being released from prison. And the joy of um, overcoming um, overcoming worry and agitation, which is that fourth hindrance, is like the joy of being released from slavery. We still have slavery in our modern times, but I think the Buddha probably referred to this because it's this incredible sense of independence and autonomy interdependence and freedom, interdependence, independence, if that makes sense. And the joy of overcoming paralyzing doubt is like the joy of arriving safe and sound after a dangerous and arduous journey. This there's so many ways we can find spiritual pleasure in life. And this morning we did the appreciative joy meditation. If we can just even tune into things we appreciate and we're grateful for, it gives us a pleasure, and it's a wholesome pleasure. And it's not the sort of a pleasure that leads to addictions. I mean, I must admit that I really like, spiritual pleasure, but I don't find myself addicted to it. It's really helpful for me to get concentrated, and it leads to uh, greater, more sublime states than just, the experience of spiritual pleasure. So what we find, and as I mentioned earlier, that joy can lead to, spiritual pleasure can lead to joy. Joy can lead to happiness, actually. And if we're thinking about these four jhanas, the four material jhanas, if we can focus on the pleasant feelings of our concentration, the pleasant experiences of our concentration, it can lead to piety. It can lead to a kind of more energized joy. And then we can focus on that joy and just, and it's easier to, it's not, I won't call it easy, but um, joy is something that is it's easier to focus on joy than something else. It's easier to get a samadhi with joy because it's so pleasant to attend to. So when we can do that, happiness can arise. And when we can do that, when we can absorb and uh, sit with happiness, it can lead to um, this contentment, this kind of happiness mixed with equanimity. And then further, when we focus on that, it can lead to that deep state of peace and equanimity and stillness and unshakability, which is equanimity. Um, so I've described how these features are the features of the first four material jhanas before. So the feature of the first jhana is joy and rapture or piety. A feature of the second jhana is happiness. A feature of the third jhana is happiness and equanimity mixed, which is I call contentment. And a feature of the fourth jhana is equanimity, unshaken, balanced, where there's neither attraction nor aversion to anything, really. There's just this clear awareness. And I would have explained this in the guided meditation, but the analogies for developing these particular states of consciousness, the first jhana is like soap flakes being kneaded together into a ball, and so the soap flakes are evenly distributed. And this is how it actually feels. It's like when you're um, starting to dwell in this quality of joy, it's like um, these various experiences start to kind of meld together and become uniform and spread and evenly distributed. It's almost like you can go through your body, you can feel this joy somewhere in your body, and it's like you, with your attention, it's not exactly like you're massaging it, but it's like you're attending to it, and it starts to spread, if that makes sense. It becomes even throughout your whole body. In the second jhana, it's like a cool spring in a warm pond. That was the analogy that's used in the sutras. I I I did in the guided meditation. I talked about a cold lake with a warm spring. I think it's the same. It has the same meaning. We can possibly relate that to that a little bit more here. He was talking about in a hot climate of India, so a cool spring would have had meaning in a warm pond. And the third analogy for the analogy for the third jhana is like a lotus plant completely submerged in the water in a pond. And if you look at a lotus plant completely submerged in a pond, it's completely saturated with water. So there's this kind of pervasive experience of things becoming unified, if that makes sense. And the last one, which is really cool, the last one related to equanimity, is like a person covered with a luminous sheet. Basically, that's what it's called. That's what it's described. But it's kind of bright. Everything's bright. So they're my sense is that they're insulated from the ways of the world, but they're fully aware and aware of the world, if that makes sense. They're fully brightly aware, but they're insulated from being entangled in the ways of the world, the ways of praise and blame, loss and gain, pain and pleasure, and fame and disrepute. So when I first started to meditate about 50 years ago, um, I aspired to these jhanas as I'd learned from them from the monastics I was with and studying with and living with actually at the time. And according to the path of purification, according to this gold standard text, and according to the way the Buddha became enlightened, which was serenity, then insight. So I practiced that. And after a while, I just gave up because the way they were described in the Visuddhimagga was just way beyond my capability. It was just like so out of reach. I thought that maybe some beings can achieve this, but not me. I haven't got concentration strong enough. You know, I'm not whatever it was. And what I chose was the path of insight only. And I practiced mindfulness. I practiced the four satipatthana, the four establishments of mindfulness. And this was really great because it was accessible, practical, and it gave results. It helped me become happier. And it was kind of liberating, even if it's just at a relative sense. And then one day I was on a retreat about 25 years ago, I think. Yeah, it was about 25 years ago, just after I'd finished my master's. And, I went on a self-retreat. I thought, fantastic, I can go on retreats now. Um, and I went on a self-retreat. I was actually up in the forest retreat center in the Channon. And what I used to do is that at the night time, I just have a candle. There wasn't any electricity at that place. I used to have a candle. I'd take it down to the meditation hut, the meditation hall, sorry, and I'd be reading the sutras by candlelight because I remember I'd get quite sleepy when it got dark. So I thought, oh, this is one way to stay awake for a while rather than going to bed at 7 o'clock at night. I just read the sutras. And I came across a sutta called Kaya Gati Sutta, the Kaya Gata Sutta. And basically this translates as mindfulness immersed in the body. And it's Majjhima Nikaya 119 or 119. And in it were descriptions of the material jhanas as a way of being mindful of the body. Wow. I thought, wow, that's so interesting because I'd studied in the Visuddhimagga, the path of purification, that the first jhana is kind of, there's no sensory input at all. Like you're out of your body and there's no kind of connections with body. It's so refined that it's all mind. And what I was saying here was that you could actually feel these experiences in your body. It was a way of being mindful of your body. And and in fact, when I read through it, I had similar experiences to what they were describing. Oh, I've had that experience of like, bubbly energy, energetic joy. I've had the experience of happiness. I've had the experience of contentment. And I've had the experience of kind of equanimity, like a peacefulness. It may not have been at the level that one would normally describe of the jhanas, like that deep level, but I had these experiences nonetheless. And what I discovered thereafter was that there were disagreements in how the jhanas are understood and practiced, and the depth of concentration that is needed for them to be called a jhana. There's a large discrepancy. uh, and so I started reading Lee Brasington's work and practicing with Lee. And he described these 8 jhanas to like swimming in 8 different pools. And I'll just quote what he said. One may swim on the surface of the water, wade in. One may skim the surface of the water, wade in, swim on the surface, or dive in deep. However one enters, to whatever depth, the pools of water are still the same pools. The 8 jhanas remain the same, even though the depth of experience differs depending upon how one engages with them. So cool. So, I may have not been diving in deep to these jhana experiences, but I was having similar experiences nonetheless. And, I don't care if they're even not called jhanas because for me, I mean, it was personally very helpful. Um, I wasn't regarding the scholarly arguments because I was just basing my understanding on actual experience. And for me, they brought a level of happiness. They brought a level of joy. They brought a level of contentment and a level of equanimity. And in addition, it turbocharged my insight practice because I would practice these jhanas or my emulations of the jhanas, I'll say it like that. Then I'd turn my attention to something you could call insight based. I'll turn my attention to seeing the impermanence of my self concept, for example, or my ego, or I turn my attention to hearing the impermanence in sound, or seeing the emptiness in an experience. And it was really strong, it was really powerful. So, in addition, this serenity way of healing is nourishing to develop the wholesome and it's denourishing the unwholesome. And what I mean by this is that what we do, I mean, you all know that saying by William James, what we attend to is reality. William James was a famous humanist, not humanist, he was a famous psychologist. He was a forefather of psychology. And he made that statement about consciousness. What we attend to becomes our reality. Well, not quite like that, but uh, and there's also those sayings with neuroscience that goes something like this: neurons that fire together wire together. And the opposite of that, of course, is use it or lose it. In other words, what we attend to by attending to something, it can actually grow neurons. There's neuroplasticity in that. Like, for example, I always bring up the example of me playing a guitar, but I think it's a useful analogy, a useful example, sorry. The more I play guitar, the more I have neuronal growth in the areas related to that guitar playing, like, fine finger movement, playing notes quite tricky to go like this. I didn't start learning guitar until I was about 60, I think. So it was quite difficult to move my fingers up and down the fret. And also learning to play music and also having rhythm. There's a whole range of things that are being developed in our brain when we play music. And the more I play that, the more that attention grows my brain, actually. It actually grows neurons. And of course, if I don't play the guitar, I lose it. Which I don't, I often do that. I often not play the guitar, like sometimes for months, like currently. I haven't played for a couple of months because I've been a bit busy. But so what can happen here is what we can do is we can attend to the wholesome and not attend to the unwholesome, which is what happens with serenity meditation. Um, Sometimes when clients come to me, I'll talk about, what we can do and with their particular issues. Sometimes they come with traumas that they're holding on to or particular habits of mind that are really unhealthy. And I say to them, we can go the insight way or the serenity way. And they say, what do you mean by that? Well, the serenity way is like prioritizing what we attend to. With the serenity meditation, what you do is you focus on one object. And in meditation practices, we're usually focusing on or attending to something that's wholesome or something that's neutral. And what we do with that is we don't attend to the unwholesome. It's like we're prioritizing our attention to go along one particular pathway and not along another pathway. So if someone is coming to you with worrying thoughts, like the tendency to worry all the time, or coming to me with the tendency to worry all the time, I'll invite them to practice, say, a concentration-based meditation or a serenity meditation, where they're just paying attention to their breath. And whenever a worrying thought comes up, just disregard it. Don't buy into it. Let it fall away. Don't feed into it. So we're nourishing the wholesome rather than nourishing the unwholesome. So, and ultimately, that pathway or that pathway that represents worrying thinking and our tendencies fade away. They just disappear. The insight way is, say, if we're coming with a worrying pattern, we look at worrying to see it for what it is, actually what it is, rather than not attending to it. We're attending directly to it, but we're attending directly to it with a perspective of seeing it as it is, rather than believing that this is a direct readout of who and what I am, rather than taking it personally, rather than seeing it as a lasting thing that goes on forever. We're actually seeing the impermanence, the unreliability of it, and it's not self-nature. It is not what I am, if that makes sense. So coming back to this decision between serenity and insight, and this practice of serenity and insight, they both have benefits. And what I've noticed is that with my clients, with my patients, I can suggest we go down the insight path or the serenity path as a way of healing. So coming back to understanding these ways of happiness, these ways of cultivating joy, happiness, contentment, and peace, we can think about what Rick Hanson talks about with heal, the heal analogy. Many of you heard me talk about heal. And in my opinion, the HEA of heal and refers to cultivating serenity. H refers to having and noticing or imagining a positive experience. E stands for enriching it with words or reminders and images and imagination. A stands for absorbing into it. And this absorbing into it is like relaxing into it, sinking into it, marinating into it, or just becoming it. Like I've described in our earlier meditation, we absorb into experience, which is the path of serenity. And the L of heal refers to linking. And sometimes people have called it learning actually, which is quite true actually as well. So what happens here is that we build up such a strong experience with the positive that it becomes our dominant state of mind. We become absorbed into it. Then we have a reminder of something that was quite negative in relationship to that positive, and it comes up in the background, but the positive is so powerful and strong because we've been focusing on it, we've been absorbing into it and so on, that the negative aspect of it, or the negative memory, just pales in comparison. It just fades away. It has no impact. And this is a way of healing. So the analogy is quite nice. And often what I'll do is I'll just encourage people to just have the HEA of this experience. In other words, you're having some spiritual pleasure. You're having some happiness. You're having some joy, happiness. You're having some contentment. You're having some equanimity. And just strengthen them. Strengthen them. And let the linking come naturally, like in daily life. It's like that happiness, well-being, contentment, peace becomes our default state of mind rather than the opposite. Look, I was on a retreat a couple of months ago, and I was just playing with the jhanas, basically, whether you want to call them real jhanas according to some people's definitions or otherwise. I come to these places such as contentment, and there'll be a bit of shaking around there, but I'd look deeply, and I'd say I'd find times that reminded me of when I was completely content. Content in the sense of who and what I am, for example, or my life, or something about being good enough, for example. Often we don't feel good enough. And if we can just touch on a moment of feeling good enough, that's like an experience of contentment. When you can touch on such a moment and you can sustain your attention on that moment, come back to it, it's like it becomes our way of being. We become absorbed into it, and it becomes our default mode of being, if that makes sense. It's really, really healthy to do this. Again, contemplating joy. How much do we not have joy in our lives? We miss out on it. To be able to contemplate and absorb into joy, even if it's at these sub-jhana levels, just to be joyous for a while, to absorb into it, to marinate in it. It completely changes our way of being. And this is the power of this process. Now, I haven't talked about, as I mentioned earlier, haven't talked about regardless of what is happening in the world. I think that a lot of terrible things are happening in the world. And on this retreat, I remember having a choice. I was ruminating about something. To be honest, I was ruminating about the state of the world and the state of injustice and the oppression that we can see around the world, and the colonizing effect on people. And I was thinking about the Gaza, and I was thinking about Ukraine and so on. And it was kind of pulling me into quite a depressive state. And then I was practicing and I was meditating, and I saw this choice. I said, I can go down that roadway or that pathway, or I can go down the pathway of contentment and joy. And I just ended up going down the pathway of joy. And what it did was, I noticed there was some hesitation to do that, because I felt like, how can I be joyous and happy and content and have equanimity, about this, when there's so many people suffering? I'm of a privileged, I'm in a privileged position here. I'm able to take time off to go on retreat. How can I not think about these other people? Well, it occurred to me that when we can actually access our natural joy, happiness, contentment, and equanimity, we're in a better position to do what is right. We're in a better position to act skillfully, act compassionately, act in the best way we can towards uh, working with this injustice, working with this oppression, working with um, colonization, working with the suffering of other beings, working with them compassionately. So we almost have an obligation to find joy, happiness, peace, and contentment. Because when we can find that, we live more aligned with the awakened state, if that makes sense. Um, so uh, I just have an analogy, and you've heard me use this analogy before. Um, when we can cultivate and strengthen positive qualities, so much so that it becomes like our default position, uh, when unwholesome patterns arises, when unwholesome patterns and tendencies arise, they just disappear. And I've used this analogy of putting a tablespoon of salt into a glass of water. Actually, this is an analogy that comes from the sutras, but it's spoken of here in another, in a different way. But it's like putting a tablespoon of salt into a glass of water, and you drink the water, you can't drink it. But if you put that same tablespoon of salt into a pristine lake, a beautiful pristine lake, it makes, I mean, the tablespoon of salt's still there, but it has little relevance. You can still drink the water and it's still really wonderful. It just kind of dissolves away completely. So this pristine lake is comparable to our wholesome qualities we can cultivate with serenity and wise attention. Oh, I've gone over time a little bit. So thank you for your attention, and may we all realize the ultimate peace and security of Nibbana. Thank you.